And Michael McKenna, president of the Hammond Tea Club, will now introduce the elements of tea, number 7, Wagashi, the art of Japanese sweets. Michael?
Martin, thank you for the introduction. I'm president of the Hammond Tea Club. In February of 2018, through the Japan Information and Culture Center, the Japan Embassy in Washington, D.C. sponsored a special program, Sweets. The embassy brought from Japan Mr. Yoshitaka Nishino, who is of the Matsukawaya, specializing in Japanese sweets in Nagoya, I believe. The embassy also engaged Ms. Stephanie Benefield, herself a student of the Omotesenke Tea, as the interpreter for the program. We cannot duplicate the workshops that the embassy provided, where participants got to make their own sweets under Mr. Nishino's direction. But we do have Mr. Nishino's discussion of the sweets made specifically for the tea ceremony. Well, as Martin explained, after the brief presentation, we'll have an opportunity to have comments from Stephanie and question and answers with all of you.
And now I'd like to invite Yoshitaka Nishino, the president and head confectioner of Matsukawaya, and Ms. Stephanie Benefield to come to the stage for the presentation about Japanese wagashi, please.
皆さんこんばんは、名古屋から来ました、お菓子どころ松川屋老舗の西野と申します。本日はどうぞよろしくお願い申し上げます。
Very nice to meet you. I'm very happy to be here from Nagoya, Japan. I am working and in charge of the Matsukawaya confectionery and very happy to meet you.
それでは最初に、お菓子の歴史をお話をさせていただきたいと思います。
I'd like to start out with explaining the history of the Japanese sweets.
古来お菓子というものは、今のようにお砂糖を使ったものではなくて、フルーツと主に、栗とか、どんぐりであるとかそういった種子、この2つを、お菓子というふうに、呼んで食べておりました。
The Japanese word for sweets is kashi, and originally this word was comprised of two different parts. The first part comes from fruit. The first character means fruit, and the second character means seeds.
この和菓子という言葉なんですが、こちらが、使われるようになったのは西暦の1868年からでございます。この1868年というのは、ちょうど日本が、明治時代開国をした年になります。
The word wagashi, or Japanese sweets, first appeared about 1868. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with Japanese history, but that was the year that after 400 years of basically being a closed country, Japan opened back up to trade with other countries, and Japan began to use the word wagashi to indicate Japanese sweets.
ここでその和菓子の、素晴らしさと、その持つ、最大の、凄さというものを、ご紹介をさせていただきたいと思います。
And I'd like to explain a little bit about what makes the wagashi different or unique as opposed to sweets in other places.
和菓子は、五感の芸術品というふうに、呼ばれております。
We could easily say that the Japanese sweets, wagashi, were actually comprised of 5 different aspects of our senses.
この五感といいますのは、視覚、それから嗅覚、味覚、 触覚、聴覚、こちらの五感を意味いたします。
And what I mean is the various human senses: sight, smell, taste, touch, and hearing.
そしてこの和菓子が五感の芸術品とそのように言われる由来なのですが、当然視覚の部分では見て美しいという和菓子ですね。
First of all, when you think about sight, when we look at the wagashi, we want to think how beautiful it is.
そして次に嗅覚、当然ながらお菓子でございますので甘いいい匂いがいたします。
And then focus on the smell of the wagashi. You will be able to sense how sweet it is.
そして、味覚、当然ながら、美味しい甘いお菓子でございます。
And then when we taste it, it'll be delicious.
それから次に触覚でございますが、お菓子の、生地によって、歯触り、また舌触りというものが変わってまいります。
And then when we taste the wagashi in our mouth, we'll feel the texture on our teeth and also around our mouth. Different types of wagashi have different feelings inside the mouth.
そして最後に聴覚なんですが、こちらが和菓子が持つ最大の魅力でございまして、魅力でございます。
One of the probably, in fact, the most important attractive point about the wagashi is related to hearing.
でこの、聴覚が最大の魅力と言われる最大のゆえんは、お菓子にそれぞれ名前がついておりまして、そのお菓子には全てにおいて、情景とそのお菓子のストーリー、物語があります。
Usually each of the wagashi has a name associated with it, and based on that name, often it'll be related to things from our past or from stories that we've heard, something that we have in our memory. And hearing the name will help us focus on that and remember that.
でこの人間が持つ五感のすべてを、使った、食べ物というものは、和菓子を置いて世界中にはございません。
In fact, probably there's no other type of sweet anywhere in the world that uses all of the five senses other than the wagashi.
そして、和菓子というものは、人間の、人の生活の中のすべての、行事、こちらに密接に、つながっております。
Another interesting facet of wagashi is that it is related to us throughout our lives, from the time we're born through all of our activities until the time that we die.
こちらの写真のように、生まれた時、また、子供の時の行事であったり、結婚式であったり、当然ながら最後には、お葬式の時にも、和菓子というものは、使われております。
And as you can see on the screen, there's a wagashi that is related to a child being born, and there's a wagashi related to children. There's Children's Day in Japan, as I'm sure you all are aware, and then some wagashi that are used at wedding ceremonies.
こちらの記事が、まだこちらは一部ではございますが、人間の、人の生活において、いろいろな行事があるわけなんですが、それぞれの行事において全て、使われる、お菓子のことが、書いてあります。
This screen is pretty detailed. It has a lot of explanation of the various times in our lives when we would be able to make good use of the wagashi. For example, of course, as we mentioned before, at a wedding, at a birth, at a special day for children, and then later on, as time goes on, people get older, 60th birthday, so forth, and then later at the time of a death and the funeral and the commemoration ceremonies. All these times people use wagashi.
ここで、和菓子を作るにあたって、秘密とまでは言いませんが、ちょっと特別なお話をさせていただきたいと思います。
And I'd like to discuss a little bit about how we make wagashi and explain some of the things that are very important in that.
和菓子は、多くの色を使います。かなり色鮮やかな、お菓子が、多くございます。
A lot of the wagashi use various colors, and many of you have probably seen them. Many strong or bright colors, and color is a very important aspect of wagashi.
でこのお菓子の色をつけることができるのは、長年、経験をした上級職人のみでございます。
So we ask only the wagashi craftsmen or experts who have been making wagashi for a very long time to select the colors and to apply the colors to the wagashi.
というのは、人というのは、感情の生き物でございます。怒っている時というのは色が強く、濃くつきますし、悲しいことがあれば色が薄くついてしまいます。
And we're all human beings, we all have emotions, and those emotions change from day to day. And for example, if a wagashi expert that's making the wagashi were to become angry or excited, probably the color would turn out to be too strong. If he or she felt really sad one day, maybe they wouldn't feel like putting as much color in, it would become pale.
絶えず、和菓子を作るときはその平常心でもって、作ることが求められ、それができるのが、長年経験した、プロの職人でございます。
So we need someone who's very stable and who's able to consistently apply the right kind of color to the wagashi every day.
そして先ほど、五感の芸術品というお話を、させていただきましたが、当然ながら、作る私たちも、絶えず五感を使っております。
And I mentioned before that wagashi is really a work of art based on our five senses. And in fact, when we're making them, this is true too.
そして毎日、作るときに、その日の気温、室温、湿度というものを肌で感じながら、五感で、お菓子を作っております。
So every day the weather is different, the temperature is different, the humidity is different, and we feel these differences through our skin. And for those of us who are making wagashi, it's very important to pay attention to that.
そして、こちらから、最後になりますが、皆さんにご提案を、いろいろと、させていただきたいと思います。
This is our last screen for today, and I wanted to make a suggestion and proposal to you all.
人というのは、何かを食べたり、飲んだりということなしで、ずっと話をしていくことはできませんし、また、お菓子とか、お茶があることによって会話も弾んでくると、そのように、思っております。
I really believe that it's impossible for people to get together and have any kind of significant conversation without eating and drinking. And if we are able to have wagashi and tea, something to eat and drink, it really will help the conversation to blossom.
また甘いもの、お菓子を食べた時っていうのは、ほとんどの方が必ずにこやかになります。怒ってお菓子を食うことはできませんので、そういった、にこやかに、過ごす時間を少しでもご提供を、させていただきたいと、そのように思っております。
And I really think it's important to have something sweet and something to drink and enjoy each other. I think it's impossible to be angry and try to eat sweets, and so no matter what the circumstances might be, as we would be having tea and sweets, certainly a good effect would come to everybody participating in the conversation.
そして最後になりますが、 お菓子の、本当に一番おいしい食べ方というのは、愛する人、大好きな人と一緒に、食べていただく、こちらが一番、お菓子のおいしい食べ方だと、そのように思っております。
And the most delicious way to enjoy wagashi is to have it with someone that you're very fond of and that you like and enjoy being with.
以上でございます。ありがとうございました。
Thank you so much.
Stephanie, thank you again for the work you put into this, interpreting this presentation. I wonder, could you tell us a little bit how specifically these sweets are used in the tea ceremony?
Oh, well, thank you. My name is Stephanie Benefield. It's nice to meet all of you. Thank you for joining tonight. In the case of the tea ceremony, there are at least 2 or 3 classifications of sweets. Mr. Nishino didn't really go into that in the presentation, but for example, there are some smaller sized, usually very sugar intensive, relatively harder texture sweets that are called dry sweets, higashi, and they have about 20% liquid in them. And then there's usually slightly larger sized and greater liquid content sweets called namagashi. Most of the pictures that I think you saw in his presentation were namagashi. They're often made of bean paste and sugar and the red beans, azuki beans, also are used. So when we are having matcha, we have 2 kinds, basically thin tea and thick tea, just exactly as they are named. Thin tea has more water and less tea, and thick tea has more tea and less water. So when we're having the thin tea, we need, well, regardless of whether it's thick or thin, we need to have something a little bit sweet in our mouth because the tea itself tends to be a little bit bitter. And in the case of thin tea, we might have these smaller sized, less liquid dense, harder textured sweet. And then with thick tea, we might have the larger size and more moist namagashi to balance the taste of the thick tea. And we would have the sweet first and then drink the tea. We don't really try to eat and drink together at the same time, finish up the sweet and then drink the tea. But they're a big part of the tea ceremony because even though we're focused on the tea itself, the sweets are a beautiful and delicious complement to the tea. And there's so many different types of sweets that it's a pleasure to try different ones and enjoy tasting and then discussing about them and then move on to the tea.
Mr. Nishino talked about the sense of hearing being one of the most important elements of the Japanese sweets, or the tea sweets. And
Yeah.
the hearing the names and the names with all the connotations they bring to the tea ceremony is one very important element. Part of the hosts laying out the menu of the tea ceremony by a seasonal sweet that picks up the reverberations of the season and of the story that she's telling or he's telling in the tea ceremony. I thought that was an interesting point he was making.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting too. And the sweets, usually when you buy them, even if you go to a store and select sweets that are right in front of you and they're boxed and then given for you to take with you, usually each one of the sweets has a name. If you buy a box of packaged sweets, very often inside there'll be a whole pamphlet describing the name and the story behind the name. And very often the name and the story might come from a famous poem or some other story that many people know. And it's much more complicated than I had ever imagined it to be at the beginning. And in fact, to take the time to read the pamphlet and understand where the name and the context is coming from is interesting. And it's part of the discussion that we can have during the tea ceremony. And I think that particularly with Japanese people who've come up through the same education system, many times there'll be a base communication, remembering these stories that they had learned in the past. They might be new to us, but they wouldn't necessarily be new to the Japanese people.
I was wondering if there was any comments from the audience that would be able to ask a question that's relevant to what they've just seen.
Yeah, would anybody like to please speak up? What did you think about the video, and did you have any thoughts or questions?
I don't see any hands, so maybe just volunteer to unmute if you just would and just ask a question. Take our chances. Well, I had a question to ask myself. The variety of sweets are so, I mean, each confectionery establishment always has so much variety. Is there, I mean, is there a pattern that you see that like sticks to the same style, the same themes, or are they like just totally random?
I think there's so many different ways to make the sweets, but basically the ingredients include, for example, rice flour or mochi, pounded rice, or of course, sugar. And sometimes, as Mr. Nishino mentioned, seeds or nuts like chestnuts, and dried fruit sometimes is incorporated, or even sometimes these days you'll see fresh fruit incorporated, and of course various types of bean paste. When it does not usually include, though, butter and eggs, things that we associate with sweets. Sometimes there is flour used, not only rice flour, but also wheat flour. And some sweets are not so much sweet as they are perhaps a little bit salty. And so we have all these ingredients available, and each, probably almost every town in Japan has a confectionery that will be making some kinds of sweets. And they may have their own specialties, but larger establishments like the one that Mr. Nishino runs has continuous variety he has, of course, namagashi, which is what we were talking about initially in the presentation. And in fact, during, you didn't see, but there were demonstrations of how to make a namagashi. And then in addition to that, the higashi, which is a little bit of rice flour with a certain kind of sugar, a little bit of moisture, and pushed this kind of almost paste is pushed into molds and then dried and later pushed out. So they have very pretty shapes. In addition to those types, then there's also, for example, bean paste on the inside and some rice cracker on the outside, bean paste on the inside and perhaps something like a pancake on the outside, bean paste on the inside, and some kind of cookie-like dough on the outside. And these change depending upon the time of the year. I mean, they could change, every day. They could change if there was a big volume. They could change every few weeks, certainly, the shapes and colors. So even if you're going to the same store, you go one day, you go back the next, whatever you had before may not be there. And you can always look forward to different shapes, colors, tastes coming up from time to time. And that's one of the fun things about doing the tea ceremony also, is there's so much variety. Sweets, and also with the tea, and a little bit of variety with the method of the procedure. And I think that sweets in Japan were initially fruit and nuts, but by the time that the tea first came to Japan around the 600-700s, also there were some sweets that were imported from China. So Japanese people began trying that. And again, when tea came the second time, around the 1100s, 1200s, the sweets also came from China. At that time, some sugar came, a type of sugar came. And a few people, obviously it wasn't easily available, but some people were able to make some kind of sweets with a little bit of sugar. And then by the time the Portuguese came, they brought sugar, and that definitely began to change the availability of sweets for more and more people. And also Okinawa began growing sugarcane, and the Portuguese showed how to grow some sugar on the main part of Japan also. So from that point forward, the sweets, say from the 1600s, started becoming more available and more varied. And then, as he mentioned in the presentation, by 1868, when Japan reopened, many new things were coming to Japan, including Western style sweets, cake, and so forth. So the word wagashi, wa meaning Japan, was added to differentiate the Japanese style sweets from the sweets from other countries. Yeah.
Are there any other questions out there? Please don't be shy.
Yeah. Please, you're most welcome.
Unmute.
I have a question. How do we know when to, is there a certain time when, like, for example, is higashi more popular during the summer as opposed to other forms of wagashi? I just wonder, because they're all so delicious, but I just wonder if some are more seasonal than others?
I think definitely the namagashi are very seasonal. Usually they are made for a season or an occasion or something like that. And it seems to me that the higashi also can be very seasonal in the summer. Maybe it is higashi that looks like water, or you know, when you get the fall, they have colored leaves, or spring would have cherries, blossoms, or plum blossoms and so forth, and various shapes for the new year. So they're seasonal too, but I think there's other kinds of higashi that are kind of neutral, and you could really use them anytime. So yes, I guess both. I don't think either one is more than the other. The length of time that the namagashi is fresh, though, is shorter, doesn't last as long. So we can't really keep it. You can put it in the freezer, I guess, but it's not as good after that. There's also senbei. I'm sure you all are familiar with that, and certain other rice crackers with some filling perhaps in the middle that seem fairly neutral as far as seasonal use would go. So yeah, there's a lot of seasonal ones, and there's a lot that are not. Yeah.
Do you have one that you thought was very original, that really surprised you?
Well, actually, when Mr. Nishino was here, he had a couple of people with him, and they made a wagashi that looked like an American eagle, a little eagle,
Wow.
to commemorate being in the United States. I don't have one, but I remember it. That was really kind of surprising to me. You know, the head of a bird
Yeah,
is
a
sitting
bald
up bald eagle, on the little okaishi paper. So I don't know, all of them I really enjoy watching, looking
But are
at.
there some that are kind of more interesting flavors that are just interesting? I mean, for example, I only go to Japan in the summer, you know, so I wonder if during persimmon season, maybe there's one that tastes more like persimmon or something. I don't know.
Oh, yes, I think so. I mean, persimmon in the fall is really delicious. And also chestnuts. There are often sweets made with chestnuts, or just made by boiling down the chestnuts into like a yokan type of sweet, and many for the New Year's time. And in the spring, when the weather starts warming up, there's sakura mochi, and actually tastes like cherry. And kashiwa mochi has a particular flavor. So yeah, they're very lovely flavors that come at other times of the year outside of summer. Yeah.
So I have a question. Hello.
Hello.
I'm a complete novice at this. I've never attended one of these before. And I was wondering, what are the primary ingredients of wagashi? I'm not sure if that was mentioned earlier, but I didn't hear it. And or is it different for every type of wagashi in every season?
So your question, well, welcome. I'm so glad that you joined tonight, even though you hadn't joined before. Thank you for coming. And your question was,
You're welcome.
what was
What are the primary ingredients
the primary
of wagashi?
ingredient? Okay. There would be things related to rice, like pounded rice or rice flour, maybe arrowroot, various types of beans, various types of sugar, wheat flour. Um,
Okay.
mhm. And
So
then
Two
it's
things.
not like our, I was going to say, it's not like our gingerbread where there's one kind of primary recipe and then people sort of put their own little twist on it occasionally. It sounds like it's more diverse than that.
I think there's certain types. You could divide the sweets into different types, and then certain types would have certain basic ingredients. Very often, for example, in the case of the namagashi, it's beans. They could be lima beans or azuki beans, and then maybe rice flour or mochi. And then you could use those ingredients and create various shapes, colors, textures from that. So in addition to that, though, there's also wagashi that are kind of baked, that have, for example, the bean paste on the inside with a cookie type of dough on the outside. So that's another style. But those are the basic ingredients. And in addition, the one that I mentioned that was higashi, it's mostly sugar with a little rice flour and some flavoring.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Valerie on the chat line just asked, I mean, do householders also make sweets or only professionals?
Oh, householders also make sweets. And for example, I'm living in Northern Virginia, and Mr. Nishino went back to Japan. So we don't have anybody who's a professional here to give us sweets. And sometimes, at least before the pandemic came, we had a group that would practice tea together here. And so we would make our own sweets. We would, you know, buy the rice flour and moisten it with water and add sugar, and then get bean paste and make very simple shapes of wagashi. And also we would make a use sugar and kind of an arrowroot, and mix that together until it became thick. That was just add coloring and some other flavors. So very simple things we certainly can do, and it's fun, and in the end, delicious too. It's just it's a treat to have someone who is a specialist and can make something really beautiful and lovely for us. One thing I did notice, though, with Mr. Nishino that I didn't know before was, of course, they're professionals and they have to make a whole lot of sweets every day, but they had gigantic, well, I guess about, say, 15 by 15 or something, big blocks of already prepared bean paste, you know, that it would cut out a small piece and roll it into a ball. And then they would combine that with the other ingredients, and they were able to make their sweets faster. So they didn't take the time. Maybe sometimes they do, but they also have some shortcuts to be able to do it faster, which householders who are not professional or usually don't have access to those products. When we make them, it's just kind of the best we can with what we have. Yeah. That's a good question.
I had a story that you might find interesting. Stephanie-san knows this very well, as do other people who study the Chanoyu. When you go to your class 3 or 4 times a month. In every class, you have the opportunity to perform a tea ceremony and to receive sweets and tea prepared by students. So you get very familiar with different types of during your study of the tea ceremony. And when I first went to study, when I lived in Tokyo, people that were studying there were very, very serious, very, very focused on their study. But when we got to talk later and I asked them how they got introduced, why they studied tea, Omotesenke tea, they all said, oh, we first came here because we like sweets. And then we decided that we would study tea so we could have a sweet every week. And I think that's very common for people, especially in Japan, who study the ceremony.
I've always heard that too. And in fact, I think when children start to study tea, certainly the sweets are much more important than the tea. Yeah.
Yes. Anybody else? Any other questions or comments?
Well, thank you all so much. Really appreciate you joining.
Definitely, I want to thank you and, you know, for contributing to this and actually bringing it to the Hammond Museum. And actually, I hope down the line that we could actually look forward to more adventures, you know, with the elements of tea that Michael's hosting and being able to explore areas of tea that goes beyond our borders of the New York State. So let's keep the conversation going. And Michael, do you have anything else to add?
Yes, I do. This was our 7th program. If you've joined us for the first time or only seen us once or twice, please go to YouTube and look for Hammond Elements of Tea. The recordings of the previous sessions are all available. Next month, December, take a break. We won't have a program next month. Beginning again in January on the 4th month, we plan to continue on with programs on different elements of tea, the tea itself, the tea caddies, are 2 topics that we plan to pick up next year. Then we plan to hold a face-to-face tea ceremony that brings all these elements again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks for everybody for joining.